The repo truck backed up over the flower bed first. Not by accident either, because the driver had the whole gravel turnaround to work with, and he chose the roses instead. The roses a man named Walter Hale had planted for his wife the spring he came home from the war, and the tires pressed them flat into the mud, while a woman in her 70s stood on her own front porch in her housecoat and asked them please, please, to wait just 1 minute. They did not wait. A second truck came up behind the first, and a man in a pressed shirt with a clipboard read a number off a page, $11,200, and told her the property no longer belonged to her as of 9 that morning, and that she had until noon to remove personal effects. It was 7 minutes past 10. Neighbors stood at the ends of their driveways with their coffee going cold in their hands, and not one of them crossed the road. That is the part nobody likes to remember later, the standing and the watching. The way a whole street can decide at once that a thing is somebody else's problem. Down at the end of Margaret Hale's gravel drive, leaning against the fence post the way he leaned against everything, was an old man in a grease-dark canvas jacket, gray in his beard, gray in what was left of his hair, hands hanging loose and open at his sides. 68 years old. He had come to fix her furnace and stayed to watch her lose her house. Nobody on that street that morning had the first idea what they were looking at. What the man with the clipboard did not know, what the hospital that sent him did not know, what none of them had bothered to learn, was who that quiet old man at the fence post used to be. A long time ago, in rooms a lot harder than that suburban street, men who had killed other men used to go quiet when his name came up. And the young executive who had signed off on the foreclosure, the one who never once left his office, had just made a miscalculation that would cost him everything he had spent 10 years building. Nobody there understood that yet. But before that week was out, 400 motorcycles would come down that county road in a line half a mile long and stop those trucks where they sat. Stay with me, because the confrontation is the smallest part of this story. The reason it happened at all is the part worth sitting still for. It started barely 3 weeks earlier than that morning on the porch. To understand any of it, you have to understand the shop and the man who kept it, and the hour he opened it. Earl Dickerson opened his doors at 6 every morning, and he had opened them at 6 every morning for 19 years, in the cold and in the heat, on the mornings his knees worked and the mornings they did not. The shop sat at the edge of town where the county road went to gravel, a low cinder-block building with a hand-painted sign that just said Dickerson. No first name, no phone number, because the people who needed him already knew where he was. Inside, it smelled of gear oil and coffee and cold iron. The kind of smell that means a place has been the same for a long time and intends to stay that way. He fixed motorcycles, mostly. Old ones. The heavy American iron that other shops turned away because the parts were hard to find and the men who rode them were harder to please. But he fixed other things too. Lawn mowers for widows. A furnace when somebody asked. A busted screen door. He never sent a bill that matched the work, and more than a few times he sent no bill at all. And if you tried to thank him for it, he would look at you until you stopped. Big, he was, in a way that had nothing to do with size, because he was not a tall man, and the years had taken the width off his shoulders. Quiet, mostly. But when Earl spoke, people leaned in without meaning to, and they did what he said before they finished deciding whether they meant to. 2 years back, a kid had turned up at the shop. 19, maybe 20, thin as a rail, with a black eye going yellow at the edges, and everything he owned in a garbage bag on the back of a bicycle he had clearly not paid for. His name was Danny. He did not say where he was running from, and Earl did not ask. And that was the whole of the interview. Earl handed him a shop rag and pointed at a carburetor soaking in a pan and said, "Clean that." And the boy cleaned it. And he had been there ever since. Earl gave him the key on the second day, gave him the couch in the back, and then, when winter came, first month's rent on the little apartment over the hardware store. Paid quiet, never mentioned. He never once raised his voice at the boy, not when Danny dropped a fuel tank and dented it, not when Danny bad-mouthed a customer who deserved it, but was still a customer. Danny had learned young not to trust a man's kindness, because, in his experience, it always came with a bill at the end. 2 years he waited for Earl's bill. It never came. And somewhere in the second year, the boy stopped waiting for it. And that was the closest thing to being a son he had ever known. The town around them was going soft in the way towns do. The mill had closed. The bank on the square had become a branch of something bigger with a name that meant nothing. And then, 2 years before all this, the hospital changed hands. It had been the county hospital, a plain brick building where they set your arm and delivered your grandkids and let you pay it off $10 a month if that was what you had. A company bought it, out of state. They kept the building and the sign and changed everything behind them. And the first thing they changed was the way they came after money. Nobody fought it. Fighting it got you a lawyer you could not afford against lawyers who did nothing else all day. Or worse, it got your name in a file, and your file grew. And one morning there was a truck in your flower bed. The company ran the whole thing on fear instead of fairness, because fear was faster, and fear did not require them to look anybody in the eye. The man who ran it was 31 years old. His name was Bradford Kane, and he had a small, pale scar through one eyebrow from a childhood most people would have felt sorry for if he had ever let them see it. He wore good suits and a watch that cost more than a mechanic made in a season, and he had a smile he used like a tool, a smile that came up fast and never once made it as far as his eyes. He had built his career on a single skill, which was finding the money that ordinary decency had left on the table and taking it. There was a reason if you dug for it. His own father had been a man who owed people, a man who took his hat off and looked at the floor when other men spoke to him, a man who absorbed one humiliation after another all his life and never answered a single one of them. And Bradford Kane had decided somewhere around the age of 10 that he would rather be the one holding the paper than the one holding the hat. It explained him. It did not excuse him. The men who came after Margaret Hale's house did it because a young man had promised himself 30 years ago that he would never look at the floor again. And he was making an old woman he had never met pay the balance on that promise. Margaret Hale was 73. Her husband Walter had come home from Vietnam with a piece of shrapnel too close to his spine to remove, and a way of going quiet that she had learned to sit inside of. They never had much. They had the house, which they had paid for over 30 years, dollar by dollar. And they had the roses. And they had each other. And for a long time, that had been enough for both of them. Walter got sick the winter before last. The new hospital treated him, and they treated him well. Machines and specialists and a room with a window. And when he died in the spring, they sent Margaret a bill for the treating, $11,200, after the insurance had done what little it was going to do. She paid what she could. She sent them $40 a month, every month, in an envelope with a stamp she licked herself. And every month a letter came back that said it was not enough. She did not have more. She lived on Walter's small pension and the Social Security, and she had already sold the truck. What she did not know What nobody told her was that the hospital had a policy now, a new one, of handing small unpaid balances to a collections arm that took people to county court over them, and that a lawsuit became a judgment, and a judgment became a lien against the home, and a lien like that could be foreclosed and the house sold at auction, and an auction could be scheduled quietly on a Tuesday morning that nobody would attend, but the buyer the hospital had already lined up. Nobody had explained that part to her either. The summons had come in a certified envelope that looked like every other envelope on the pile, and she had not answered it, because a 73-year-old woman who is already sending money every month does not understand that she is being sued, and a lawsuit nobody answers is a lawsuit the hospital wins by default, in an empty courtroom in about 9 minutes, without ever once having to stand up and prove she had refused to pay. She never refused. She just never answered. The whole machine turned on $11,200. Remember that number. It is going to come up again, and every time it does, it is going to get harder to believe. The way Earl learned about it was the way he learned about most things, which was that somebody who needed help ended up in his shop. Margaret's furnace had quit, and she called him because Walter had always called him, and the two men had known each other 40 years without either of them ever saying more than they had to. Earl drove out. He was in her basement with a flashlight in his teeth when he heard her crying upstairs. Not loud. The kind of crying a proud woman does when she thinks the water is running loud enough to cover it. He came up. On her kitchen table was the stack of letters, and the last one on top, the one with the date on it, the one that said her home would be sold at public auction in 19 days. Earl read it standing at the table with his hat still on. He read it twice. He did not say anything for a while. Margaret told him it was fine, that she would figure something out, that she did not want to trouble him, and Earl set the letter down on the table, gentle as a man setting down something that might break. And he said one word. He said, "No." She thought he meant he could not help. She was wrong about that. He meant, no, this is not going to happen. And he had already, standing in that kitchen with his hat on, made a decision that a younger version of himself would have recognized instantly and been afraid of. Because here's the part everybody wants to skip straight to. So let me slow down, because you need to understand exactly who was standing in that kitchen before you watch what he did with the next 19 days. On the wall of Earl Dickerson's shop, back in the corner where the light did not reach, there was a photograph. It had hung there so long the paper had gone the color of weak tea. Danny had asked about it once, and Earl had told him it was a long time ago, and left it there. And the boy had not asked again, because that was how you learned to talk to Earl. The photograph was of men on motorcycles, a lot of them, lined up on a stretch of desert highway that went to the edge of the world and kept going. And near the front of that line, younger, dark-haired, was Earl, and the men around him were not looking at the camera. They were looking at him. There is a kind of standing a man does when the men around him have decided he is the one they will follow into the bad places, and Earl was standing that way in the photograph, and he had been that man once, for a long time, in the years before the boy was born and before the town went soft. He had ridden with an outfit that spread across 6 states, and for 11 years the men in it had called him by a name that was not Earl. And when he had finally set it down, when he had finally hung up the vest, years and years before he ever bought the shop and started opening the doors at 6, he had done it clean, with permission, with respect, the way almost nobody ever got to do it. The men he had ridden with did not forget him. That was the thing about that world. It kept its own. You could leave the life. The life did not leave you. And if you had been what Earl had been, the brotherhood was a phone call away for the rest of your days. And it would come, all of it, if you called and it was true. He had buried a man once, a brother, gone down on a wet road outside Flagstaff, and he had stood over the grave with the whole club behind him and made a promise out loud, one word at a time, so it would hold. The way you say the words that have to hold. He had promised that as long as he was breathing, no one who could not fight for themselves would be left to the wolves while he had two hands. He had made that promise young, and he had kept it quiet for 40 years, and he had told himself the day would probably never come when he had to lift it back up off the ground. He liked the shop. He liked the 6 o'clock mornings and the smell of the coffee and the boy cleaning carburetors. He had set the heavy thing down on purpose, and he had meant to leave it down. But the promise had one condition folded inside it, one door he had left open. And the condition was this: if they came for someone who had no one, and if there was no other way, then he would pick it back up, just the once, for exactly the right reason. And Margaret Hale, sitting at her kitchen table with $40 a month and a dead husband and a truck backing over the roses, was the right reason. Earl knew it the moment he read the date on the letter. He tried the quiet way first. That is important, and people forget it. He did not call anybody. He drove to the hospital, and he sat in a waiting room for 2 hours in his clean shirt. And when they would not let him see anybody who mattered, he left a message, polite, that a mistake had been made regarding the Hale property, and he would like to correct it before it went further. He offered to pay it. He had the money, some of it, and he could get the rest, and he said so plainly to a young woman behind glass who wrote none of it down. He went back a second time. The third time, a man came out, not Kane, one of Kane's, and told Earl that the auction was a legal proceeding and that the property would be sold and that Mr. Dickerson had no standing in the matter, and asked him to leave. And Earl left, because Earl always gave the quiet way every chance it had. Bradford Kane heard about the old man in the grease jacket who kept coming to the front desk. He heard about it the way you hear about a fly at a window. He told his people the auction went forward as scheduled, and that if the old man came again, they should call the police. And then he forgot about it entirely. Because to Bradford Kane, an old mechanic offering to pay a stranger's medical bill was not a threat. It was a joke. It was exactly the kind of soft, useless decency his father would have shown, and he had built his whole life on being nothing like his father. That was his miscalculation. That was the whole of it. He had looked at Earl Dickerson and seen a man holding a hat. The morning of the auction came, and I told you how it went, the trucks and the roses and the neighbors with their cold coffee. So let me take you back to that fence post now, back to the old man standing there with his hands hanging open, because that is where we left him. Earl had not come to make a scene. He had come, one more time, the quiet way, with a cashier's check folded in the inside pocket of the canvas jacket, made out for the full amount, $11,200, ready to hand to anyone with the authority to take it. He had gotten there early and gone to the man with the clipboard and offered it, and the man with the clipboard had smiled the way you smile at a child, and told him the property had already sold, that morning, to the prearranged buyer for a fraction of its worth, and that the check was no good to anybody, and neither was he. And then the trucks came up the drive, and the driver aimed for the roses, and Margaret came out on the porch in her housecoat and asked them please to wait. And Earl watched a young man in a pressed shirt read $11,200 off a page to a 73-year-old widow like it was a verdict. And he watched the roses go flat under the tires, and he watched the whole street decide it was somebody else's problem. He put the useless check back in his pocket. He pushed off the fence post, and he came up that gravel drive the way he did everything, slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world, and something in the way he moved made the driver of the second truck put his cigarette down. Earl did not touch anybody. I want to be clear about that, because this is the part where a lesser story reaches for the fists, and this story does not. Not yet. Not here. He walked up to the man with the clipboard, and he stood a half-second longer than he needed to, close enough that the man had to look up. And he said one thing, quiet. He said, "You are going to want to stop the trucks." That was all. The man with the clipboard laughed. He stopped laughing about 4 seconds later, not because Earl had done anything, but because of what he saw in the old man's face, which was nothing at all. No anger, no fear, just a patience so complete it was worse than either one. There is a look certain men have, men who have already been all the way to the bottom of violence and come back up and decided against it. And when they look at you like that, your body understands the danger a long time before your mind catches up. The man with the clipboard understood it in his body. He told the trucks to hold. Not because Earl made him, because some animal part of him recommended it. And Earl turned and went up onto the porch and took off his hat in front of Margaret Hale. And he told her, quiet, to go inside and put the kettle on. That this was going to take a few days, but it was going to be all right. And she believed him. Because when Earl said a thing, people leaned in and did it before they finished deciding whether they meant to. He got her inside. He walked back down the drive. And then he did the one thing he had promised a grave 40 years ago he would only ever do for exactly the right reason. He took out his phone, and he made a call. The phone rang in a bar 300 miles away, a low place at the edge of another town. And a man behind the counter answered it, a man past 60 with arms gone to leather, and a memory that went back further than the building. Earl did not say much. He never did. He gave a name, his old name, the one from the photograph, the one nobody in his current life had ever heard him say. And there was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough that Earl asked if the man was still there. The man was still there. He was sitting down slowly, is what he was doing. Because you have to understand that in that whole world, there were maybe a dozen men left alive who had the standing to use that name as their own. And the man in the bar had spent 40 years believing that Earl had hung it up for good. And hearing it come down the phone line in that flat, quiet voice meant that something had happened bad enough to bring it back. And the man in the bar had been young once when that name meant that the bad places were about to get handled. Earl told him about the widow, and the house, and the trucks, and the roses. He told him about the hospital, and the young man in the good suit who ran it. He said he was not asking for anything he could not ask for. He said, one word at a time, that he needed the brothers to come, and to come lawful, and to come in numbers, and to touch nobody, and to do nothing that any lawyer could ever hang on any of them, and to simply be there in the road until the wolves understood what they had walked in on. The man in the bar said one thing back. He said, "How many do you want?" And Earl looked up the gravel drive at the flattened roses and the old woman's kettle steaming in the window. And he said, "All of them." And just like that, the whole shape of the thing changed. Here is what happened in the days after that phone call, because Earl was wrong about one thing, and it is the same thing decent men are always wrong about. He believed that when the brothers arrived and the numbers spoke for themselves, Bradford Kane would do the sensible thing, would see the crowd and the cameras that a crowd draws, and would quietly reverse a foreclosure that was going to cost him more in bad attention than it would ever earn him in a cheap house. Earl believed men in suits were, at the bottom of it, careful. He believed they ran the numbers, and did what the numbers said. He was right about most men in suits. He was wrong about this one. And the reason he was wrong is that he did not yet know about the scar through the eyebrow, or the father with the hat, or the thing that lived under Bradford Kane's careful smile, which was not greed at all. It was terror. The terror of a boy who had promised himself he would never again be the one who backed down, and who would burn his whole company to the ground before he would let one gray old mechanic and a dead man's roses make him look like the thing he was most afraid of being. Word reached Kane's office by the second day. Not the numbers yet, just a name. One of Kane's collections men, a heavy, quiet fellow named Roy, who was closer to 60 than to 50, and who had been around long before the out-of-state company bought the place, came into Kane's office and shut the door behind him, which he had never once done, and asked Kane to describe the old man who kept coming to the front desk. Kane, annoyed, described him. Gray beard, grease jacket, called himself Dickerson. And Roy went the color of old paper. Roy sat down in the chair across from Kane's desk without being asked, which was also a thing he had never done. And he took off the cap he wore, and he turned it over and over in his hands like he had forgotten what it was for. And he asked one more question. He asked whether the old man had said anything else, any other name. Kane said no. Why? And Roy told him. Roy had ridden, a long time ago, in his 20s, before he got the bad knee and the wife and the mortgage, and became a man who repossessed things for a living. He had ridden at the far edges of the same world Earl Dickerson had once sat at the center of, close enough to have seen it, never close enough to have been trusted. And he told Bradford Kane a story that Kane did not want to hear. He told him what that grease jacket had been before it was a grease jacket. He told him about the 6 states and the 11 years and the photograph on the desert highway. He told him that the reason the old man's voice had not shaken when he said stop the trucks was that the old man had said far worse things than that to far worse men and watched them obey. And then Roy told him the part that mattered, the part Roy could not soften and hated himself for saying, which was that a man like that did not come alone, that a man like that had never in his life come alone, and that if Earl Dickerson had picked up a phone, then Bradford Kane needed to understand that the auction was already over, and the only question left was how much of everything Kane had built was going down with it. Kane did not believe him. That was the tragedy of it. A frightened young man in a good suit heard the one warning that could have saved him, and because it came dressed as fear, and because he had spent his whole life refusing to be afraid, he decided it was weakness, and he did the exact opposite of what it told him to do. He escalated, not out of appetite, out of that old terror wearing the mask of pride. He could not now back down from an old mechanic without becoming the man in his own head who took his hat off and looked at the floor. And so it stopped being a foreclosure, and it became something else. He called the company. He told them there was a threat to the auction, an organized threat, and he got them frightened too. And frightened companies reach for the one tool they trust, which is force with a badge on it. Kane placed calls. He arranged for the sheriff's department to provide, in his words, a security presence at the property to ensure the lawful removal of the former owner's effects. And he leaned on a man he golfed with to make sure the department understood that the company would remember its friends. And so a thing that started with $40 a month in a licked envelope became, by the 4th day, a scheduled confrontation with trucks and deputies on one side, and coming down the county road from 300 miles in every direction, the other thing. It had stopped being about a house. For Bradford Kane, it had become about not being his father. He did not understand yet that he was about to become something his father had never been, which was a man everyone in that county would remember. There was one man in the sheriff's department who saw it coming, and he tried to stop it, and nobody listens to him either. His name was Deputy Commander Alton Reese, and he had worn the badge in that county for 26 years, long enough to remember when the hospital was still the hospital. Reese sat across a desk from the sheriff with one finger pressed down on the operations order, on the line that said security presence, and he said a version of the thing that men like him always say, and are always right about, and are almost never heeded on. He said, "You are provoking something you do not understand, and it is going to be my deputies standing in front of it, my people, 22-year-olds with families, and when it goes bad, it is not going to be the company standing in that road. It is going to be us." He was told the order stood. He took no satisfaction in being right, because he already knew he was going to be, and the only thing a man like Reese can do when the order stands is decide privately what kind of man he is going to be when the day comes. He made that decision quietly at his own kitchen table the night before, and it was not the decision the operations order expected of him. Earl spent those days getting ready, and getting ready for Earl did not look like getting ready. It looked like sweeping the shop. It looked like 6 o'clock mornings and coffee, and the boy cleaning carburetors. But he sent people away. He told the 2 customers who had bikes in the shop to come back next week, and he locked the front. He drove out to Margaret Hale's, and he moved her, gentle, to her sister's place 2 towns over her objections, because he did not want her within a mile of what was coming. And he told her it was so she could rest, which was a kindness and only half the truth. The whole truth was that he did not want her to see it. And then there was Danny. Earl told the boy to take the truck and drive to the coast and stay there for a week, and he handed him an envelope with more money in it than the boy had ever held, and for the first time in 2 years, Danny said no to Earl. He said no, and his voice shook, and he said he knew what the photograph was. He had known for a year. He had asked around, and he was not going to drive to the coast while Earl stood on a road by himself. And Earl looked at the boy for a long time. He did not want Danny there, not out of fear for the boy, though there was that. It was because Earl did not want Danny watching him become, even for an afternoon, the man in the photograph. The man from the 6 states and the 11 years. The man who had said terrible things to terrible men and been obeyed. He had spent 2 years being the man who opened the shop at 6. He did not want the boy's last picture of him to be the other one. But the boy would not go. So Earl made him a deal. He told Danny to stand back, well back, behind the glass of the shop across the road, and to touch nothing, and to lift nothing, and to simply watch, and to remember one thing, and Earl made him repeat it back. "Whatever you see, you do not come out unless I say your name." The night before, Earl went into the back corner of the shop, under the workbench, and he opened a steel box he had checked every single morning for 19 years and never once needed. It sat back there, under the bench, behind a glass-fronted cabinet, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. He did not take a weapon out of it. That is the thing people always expect, and it is always wrong. What was in the box was the vest, the colors, the thing that certified who he had been, folded the way you fold a flag. And Earl lifted it out with both hands the way you lift a thing that has weight beyond its weight, and he did not put it on. He set it on the bench where the morning light would reach it, and he sat with it a while in the dark, and he said a few words out loud to a man 40 years in the ground outside Flagstaff, quiet, the way you talk to the dead when the room is empty. Then he checked the exits, and he counted the angles of the gravel lot in his head the way a man counts things he has counted 1,000 times, and he made a pot of coffee at 4 in the morning, and he waited for the sound of the road to change. It changed a little after 7. First, it was one engine, far off, a single low note coming down the county road out of the gray light. Then it was 2. Then it was a sound like weather coming, a sound that came up through the soles of your boots before your ears found it, and it built and built until the windows in the shop hummed with it, and Danny, standing behind the glass across the road with his hand already at his mouth, watched the first bikes come around the bend, and then the second rank, and then he lost count, because they came 4 and 5 abreast, and they did not stop coming. 400 of them, near enough, in a line that stretched back half a mile down the county road and out of sight. And they came slow, deliberate, no revving, no shouting, just that enormous, grinding patience. And they filled the road in front of Margaret Hale's house, and they filled the shoulders, and they filled the gravel lot, and they simply stopped, engines idling. And then, one after another, they shut the engines off. And the silence that came down when 400 engines died at once was the loudest thing anybody in that county had ever heard. They put their kickstands down. They did not get off the bikes fast, and they did not crowd the trucks, and they did not touch the deputies who stood in a nervous line in front of the 2 Repo trucks with their hands hovering near their belts. The brothers simply arranged themselves, quiet, across every inch of ground between the road and Margaret Hale's front door. And they folded their arms, and they waited. Men in their 60s and 70s mostly, gray, like Earl, faces like the sides of barns, and among them younger ones too, sons and grandsons, and every one of them had come lawful, and come in numbers, and come to touch nobody, exactly as Earl had asked. And their doing nothing at all was more terrible than any charge could have been. Because there is nothing a deputy can arrest a man for when he is standing still on a public road with his arms folded. There is no charge for silence. And a young deputy at the end of the line, 22, maybe 23, looked at the 400 still faces and looked at the 2 truck drivers who had gone the color of milk. And his hand came away from his belt, slow, because his body had already run the math his orders had not. Bradford Kane came. That was his second mistake, the one that finished it, because he did not have to come, and he could not stay away. He arrived in a black car with tinted glass, and he made the driver push it up the shoulder past the bikes at a crawl, and he got out in his good suit and his expensive watch, and he stood there in front of 400 men who had shut off their engines for a widow, and he tried to run the play he had run his whole life. He talked. He should have looked, and he talked instead. He said the words legal proceeding and lawful removal, and he told the deputies to clear the road, and he said that anyone obstructing would be arrested, and his voice was pitched to carry the way a man pitches his voice when he is more afraid than he can stand to show. Nobody moved. Nobody answered him. The only sound was the tick of 400 cooling engines in the morning air, that small metal ticking, like a clock somebody forgot to stop. And out of the door of the cinder block shop across the road came an old man in a grease-dark canvas jacket, and over the canvas jacket, for the first time in 40 years, he was wearing the vest. He had put it on after all. Not for pride. Danny understood it later, understood that Earl had carried it across the road and pulled it on at the very last, because the vest was the only language Bradford Kane's people would read fast enough, and because the 400 men in that road needed to see the man they had come for wearing the thing that made him theirs. Earl came across the road slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world. and 400 gray heads turned to follow him, and the old man in the bar, Roy, who had left the company 2 days before and come to stand in the road on the other side, went the color of old paper all over again. Earl walked up to Bradford Kane, and he stood a half-second longer than he needed to, and every deputy in that line took one step back without being told. And Earl said one thing, quiet. He said, "You are going to want to hear a number." Kane, white, trying to hold the smile, said, "What number?" And Earl reached inside the canvas jacket, under the vest, and he took out the folded cashier's check, the one that had been in his pocket since the morning of the auction. $11,200, made out to the hospital. And he held it up between 2 fingers so the whole road could see it. And he said, "This is what you were owed. This is all of it. It was in my pocket the day your trucks flattened her roses. I offered it 3 times, and your people laughed at me." And Earl let that sit in the ticking silence. Then he tore the check in half, and in half again, and he let the pieces fall in the gravel at Bradford Kane's feet, and he said, "Quiet, and now you get nothing. Because you have made this cost more than money, and there is not enough money in your building to buy back this morning." There was a moment there, one held moment, where the whole thing tilted on a knife, where it could have gone the other way, where a frightened young man in a good suit could have reached for the one thing that would have voided every bit of Earl's patience. And I will tell you the truth. One of Kane's private security men, a hard young fellow standing back by the black car, did move his hands toward his coat. And 400 men saw it. And not one of them moved, because Earl had told them to touch nobody, and they were his, and they held. But the silence changed. It went from the silence of waiting to the other kind, the kind that has a decision in it. And for one long, terrible second, the whole morning hung there on what a scared boy by a black car was going to do with his hand. And that was the moment the shop door opened again, across the road, and Danny came out. He had been told to stay behind the glass. He had promised. But the boy had watched the hand move toward the coat, and he had done the one thing Earl had not planned for, which is the thing the least powerful person in the story always turns out to be the one to do. He did not run at anybody. He came out of the shop holding the photograph, the old faded photograph off the back wall, the men on the desert highway, and he held it up over his head with both hands so the whole road could see it, and he shouted in a voice cracking with fear and something bigger than fear. He shouted a single sentence across that gravel lot. He shouted that everybody there was on camera, that it was already live, that it was already going out, that 400 phones were filming and half of them were streaming, and that whatever happened in the next 10 seconds, the entire country was going to watch. It was a bluff, and it was not a bluff. Some of the phones were filming, sure, plenty of them, but there was no live stream, no broadcast, nothing going out. And the boy had made the whole thing up in the 2 seconds it took him to grab the photograph off the wall. But you could watch the math land in real time. You could watch it move across Bradford Kane's face and across the face of the hard young man by the car, because it did not matter whether it was true. It only mattered that it might be. And if it might be, then every single thing that happened next would be watched by everyone forever. And there was not one man on Kane's side of that road who wanted to be the face in that video. The hard young man's hand came away from his coat. Slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing. It was over. Truly over this time, and not one blow had been struck. Deputy Commander Reese, who had parked his cruiser a quarter-mile back and walked in on foot, deliberately not in uniform, in a plain jacket over his badge, came up through the silent crowd and stood next to Earl. And he did the thing that finished it. He turned to the deputies, and he told them to stand down, that there was no lawful order being obstructed here because there was no lawful order, that the foreclosure was under review as of that morning, which it was not yet but would be by nightfall, because Reese was about to put the whole file in front of the county prosecutor himself, and in front of the state attorney general's office after that, and keep putting it in front of somebody until somebody looked. And he used Earl's old name when he said it, the name from the photograph, Quiet, a mark of respect, one old man to another. And then Reese turned to Bradford Kane, in front of 400 men and 2 truck drivers and a line of relieved young deputies, and he told him to get in his car and go home. And Bradford Kane, 31 years old, looked around at the enormous silent thing he had walked into, and he understood at last what Roy had tried to tell him in his office, and his careful smile finally, fully went out, like a candle catching a draft it had not seen coming. He got in the black car. The trucks backed out over the ruined roses one last time and left. And 400 men stood in the road until the last tail light was gone, and only then, one at a time, did they start their engines. They left the way people leave a funeral, quiet, careful, no revving, nobody looking back. They came past the shop in a long, slow line, and each one of them nodded to the old man in the vest standing at the fence post. And Earl lifted 2 fingers to each of them, one after another, 400 times. And he did not smile, and neither did they, because it was not that kind of morning. The man from the bar was the last to leave, and he stopped his bike in front of Earl, and the 2 old men looked at each other for a while without saying anything. And then the man from the bar said, quiet, "Next time do not wait so long to call." And Earl said he did not plan on there being a next time. And the man from the bar chuckled, a low, tired sound, and said that was what Earl had said 40 years ago, too. And then he rode off after the others. Roy stayed. Roy, who had quit the company, came across the road and shook Earl's hand, and could not quite look at him. And Earl told him there was coffee inside if he wanted it, and that was the whole of the forgiveness, and it was enough. What happened to Bradford Kane happened the slow way, the lawful way, the only way that ever really holds. The videos, the ones that were actually filmed, the phones the boy had bluffed about, went out over the next week the way things do now. And they did not show 400 men doing anything wrong, because 400 men had done nothing wrong, which was the whole terrible point of it. What they showed was a young man in a good suit, standing over a widow's flattened roses, reading $11,200 off a page. And then an old mechanic tearing up a check for the full amount and explaining, quiet, that it had been offered and laughed at 3 times. That was all it took. The story of the hospital that foreclosed on a dead veteran's widow over a medical bill she had been paying $40 a month spread county to county, and then further. And the out-of-state company that ran on fear discovered that fear runs the other direction just as fast, once enough people stop being afraid at the same time. The state attorney general's office opened a review, and the review found the collections policy, the one that moved small balances toward judgments and judgments toward auctions. And it found that the Hale foreclosure was one of dozens, and one long accumulating machine of records and sworn statements and internal emails, and the testimony of a heavy, quiet man named Roy, who had kept every document he had ever been handed. All of it came down at once over the following months, and the company that had bought the county hospital to squeeze it dry sold it back at a loss inside a year and left the state. and the county bought its own hospital back for the debts. Bradford Kane was not arrested. The real world rarely allows for that, and this story will not pretend otherwise. He was something worse for a man like him. He was made to give it all back with his own hands. As part of the settlement the company forced on him before they cut him loose, Kane had to personally sign the reversal of every foreclosure the collections policy had produced, dozens of them, one at a time, his own signature on each one, undoing with his own hand every bit of the thing he had built to prove he was not his father. And the last document in the stack was the Hale property. Restored, free and clear, the $11,200 forgiven entirely. And Bradford Kane sat in an empty office and signed away the last of it. And somewhere in that signing he became, at last, exactly the thing he had spent his whole life running from. A man alone in a room, giving back what he never should have taken. There was a distinction he had failed to see, and it was this. His father, the man with the hat, had been humiliated and had never taken anything from anyone. And Bradford Kane, who swore he would never be humiliated, had taken from everyone, and had been humiliated in front of the whole county anyway. He learns the difference too late to use it. A year after all of it, a letter came to the shop. It was from Kane. It did not ask for anything, which is the only kind of apology worth the paper. It did not try to explain itself, and it did not try to make itself smaller. It said, in a few plain lines, that he had thought a great deal about the morning in the road, and about the check torn up in the gravel, and that he understood now what the old man had meant when he said there was not enough money in the building to buy back that morning. It said he was sorry. That was all. Earl read it once, standing at the workbench with his hat still on, and he did not answer it, but he did not throw it away either. He put it in the steel box under the bench with the vest. Margaret Hale came home to her house. The brothers had come back the following weekend, a dozen of them this time, quiet, and they had rebuilt her flower bed and planted new roses, the same kind, and Danny had helped, and when Margaret asked whose idea it was, nobody would tell her, which is how you know it was Earl's. She lived in that house another 6 years, and every spring the roses came up, and every so often on a Saturday a few motorcycles she did not recognize would idle slow past the end of her drive, and lift 2 fingers to the porch and ride on. And she never knew all of what they were, only that Walter would have understood them, and that was enough for her. She and Earl never once talked about that morning afterward. But something between the two old friends had shifted permanently, in a way that never needed words to be real. And when she died, in her own bed, in her own house, with the roses coming up outside the window, it was Earl who carried one corner of the casket, in the grease-dark canvas jacket, and no vest, because that was not what the vest was for. Danny inherited the shop. Earl left it to him plain, in a will that fit on one page, and he lived long enough to teach the boy every last thing the boy would let himself be taught. And then one winter, quietly, without a scene, the way he had done everything, Earl Dickerson did not open the doors at 6. Danny found him in the chair by the workbench with a cold cup of coffee beside him, and the morning light just reaching the corner of the shop. And half the county came to the funeral, and men on motorcycles came from 6 states, gray now, fewer of them every year, and they stood in a line the way they had stood in the road, and they lifted 2 fingers, and they rode home. Danny kept the shop. He opens the doors at 6 every morning, in the cold and in the heat, because that is simply how the place runs now.
And back in the corner, under the workbench, behind the glass, the steel box still sits, and inside it, the vest is still folded the way you fold a flag, and Kane's letter is still under it, and Danny checks it every morning the way Earl did for 19 years, and the way he will for the rest of his own life. He has never once needed it. It sits there, year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A truck in a flower bed, a widow on a porch in her housecoat asking please to wait, a whole street with cold coffee, deciding it was somebody else's problem. It looked, in that first gray moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. The strong taking from the weak, the machine doing what the machine does. An old mechanic at a fence post with his hands hanging open and nothing at all in them. But that is the thing about quiet men. The quiet is not weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made by somebody who has already been all the way to the bottom of what violence can do to a man, and who came back from it on purpose, and decided to open a shop at 6 in the morning, and fix widows' furnaces, and hand a runaway boy a shop rag, and ask him nothing. Radford Kane looked at Earl Dickerson and saw a soft old man holding a hat. The very thing he was most afraid of being. What he should have seen was a man who had set down a heavy burden a long time ago, on purpose, with permission, and who would pick it back up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then fold it away again for good. Authority built on fear collects its own debt eventually, with interest, and it collected Bradford Kane's in front of the whole county on a morning that could not be bought back. And power, the real kind, has nothing to do with a title or a good suit or a watch that costs more than a season's wages. It has to do with one thing only. It has to do with who comes down the county road, 400 strong and half a mile long, when you finally pick up the phone. Here is what I keep coming back to, and it is not the road, and it is not the torn check, and it is not the 400 engines going quiet all at once, as much as all of that stays with a person. What stays with me is the 6 years of roses after, and the boy opening the doors at 6, and a steel box that never gets opened. The confrontation was the smallest part of this whole story. It always is. So let me ask you something, and I read every answer, I truly do. When Danny came out of that shop, holding a faded photograph over his head and shouting a bluff into a silence full of guns, what would you have done in his place? Would you have stayed behind the glass like you promised? Or would you have come out? Tell me down below. And if this is the first time you have found your way here, welcome. This is a place where we tell the long stories, the ones about quiet men and kept promises and debts of kindness paid back years later, the ones that take their time. If that is the kind of story you have been missing, stay a while, subscribe, and ride along with us. There are 2 more waiting for you right there on the screen, and I think you will want to sit with both of them. Thank you for being the kind of person who stays all the way to the end. It says something about you, and it is the good thing. This story is a work of fiction. It was inspired by general themes of loyalty and quiet strength, and all persons and events depicted are entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental, and it was created for entertainment.